So sorry. My name is Justin Laing, and I'm really privileged to be here today in this conversation presented by the Alliance for Police Accountability, asking youth incarceration, what's at stake? And we're going to go from 4 to 6 and have a free-flowing conversation. I hope people post questions in the chat so that the very knowledgeable panelists can respond to them. And I'm just going to begin by introducing who is going to be, who you'll be hearing from today. So first, Judge Mick Pappas. Mick Pappas is a district judge or magistrate in the East Liberty area of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 2017, he was elected on a platform of pushing back against mass incarceration, preventing evictions, and disrupting the school to prison pipeline. Some of his accomplishments as a judge have indeed reduced the truancy conviction rate by 40%, and serving as an appointed member of the Pittsburgh Public Schools District Reimagined School Safety Task Force. We'll also be joined by Bethany Hallam, a lifelong Pittsburgher. Bethany was elected in 2019 as Allegheny County Councilperson at Large. She ran for office as one of the first people in the country to do so as a formerly incarcerated person in long-term recovery from opioid use disorder. She also serves as a member of the Allegheny County Jail Oversight Board. We'll next be followed by Tiffany Sizemore. Tiffany is an associate clinical professor of law at Duquesne University Law School, where she developed and directs the Youth Advocacy Clinic, which seeks to dismantle the school to prison pipeline by representing youth in delinquency and in education matters. Prior to joining Duquesne Law, Tiffany was the deputy director for the juvenile decision at the Office of Public Defender in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, where she served for over 2 years. As deputy, Tiffany wrote and implemented new practice standards across the juvenile division. Prior to being in Allegheny County, Tiffany was a trial attorney for 8 years at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, which is widely regarded as the premier public defender organization in the country. Tiffany is a board president for the Juvenile Defender Association of Pennsylvania. And Tiffany also is the board president, serves on many local boards related to children and families with several community organizations. And finally, we have Dr. Kathi Elliott. Kathi Elliott is the mother and founder of Gwen's Girls. Dr. Kathi Elliott believes in giving back to others, a value that has been instilled in her by her mother, Dr. Kathi Elliott, who is the founder of Gwen Girls, the late Commander Gwen Elliott. I'm so sorry. I'm going to do that all over again so that we properly introduce Dr. Elliott. Dr. Kathi Elliott believes in giving back to others, and it's a value that has been instilled in her by her mother and founder of Gwen's Girls, the late Commander Gwen Elliott. In August of 2015, Dr. Elliott accepted the CEO position at Gwen's Girls. Dr. Elliott has over 25 years of experience in social service, community, and individual mental health treatment. Her career began as a victim advocate at the Center for Victims, mostly within the juvenile justice system. In 2016, Gwen Girls contributed in the production of a report, Inequities Affecting Black Girls in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, which led to a convening of an annual equity summit for Black girls to address racial and gender biases that exist within the juvenile justice, health and wellness, child welfare, and education systems. As a result of the summit, Dr. Elliott spearheaded the formation of the Black Girls Equity Alliance, a collaboration of over 75 practitioners, researchers, system administrators, and other stakeholders committed to addressing system inequities in the juvenile justice, child welfare, education, and healthcare systems. Dr. Elliott has served on numerous boards and professional committees throughout her career. She is most proud to be the mother of 2 children and a grandmother to an 18-month-old granddaughter. So just great to be here. We're going to begin with just a question to all of the panelists, which is just to share, as you think about juvenile justice, as you do your work in juvenile justice, what is your focus? What do you really key in on in your work? What is that piece of the whole, this work that you hold most dear and most important? And please, we'll just let anyone just jump in, and we'll just kind of move through as you're called to do so.
As I was going to say, I will start. I will take one for the team and kick us off here, since last one in, first one up. So this work is something that is truly what I'm most passionate about as someone who was in the juvenile justice system and as both a youth and then again an adult criminal justice system as well. I recognize everywhere we go a privilege that I carry, that when I was a child in the juvenile system, I didn't understand it as much. A white girl from the North Hills, parents who were able to, pay my fines and keep me out of jail for failure to pay, and be able to just support me in a way that not only did my race play a factor into my privilege, but also my upbringing and the support that I inherently had, is really what motivates me every day. Is once I realized how many that was privilege, that wasn't normal for so many folks that are in our system, especially children. That's what really drove my passion, is realizing, like, of all the inequalities in the world, there are children who are being locked up and doing life as babies. And especially most recently, when I did a tour as a member of the Jail Oversight Board of the children's pod in the ACJ, and realized that these were little kids, like kids that were young enough that probably still, needed somebody to look after them. And instead they're locked up in a cage. And at this point they were under a COVID lockdown, and they weren't even getting their education. They were getting just packets of papers to do. And they were all contracting COVID. And, all they wanted was the most basic necessities. None of them, unlike some of the other adult pods in the jail, were like, when I say, what can I do for you? None of the kids said, get me out of here. Not one single kid. That was the one thing that they wanted, was get me out of here. They wanted basic things like hot water to make soup, headphones to listen to music on their tablets, phone calls to be able to talk to their family, visits to resume so that their families could come see them. It was the most basic things that so many of us take for granted. And these are babies that us as adults are all responsible for protecting. I mean, that's what drives my passion.
And I'll go next. I think, Justin, what you mentioned in my bio is the start at the Center for Victims. And I was a victim advocate and managed the victim services at juvenile court. And it was there that when I first started, it was, about the victims and making sure when we talk about restorative justice and that, justice is served. But as I started to work with the victims, and oftentimes there were young victims, I saw the cyclical effect. Like 1 minute, in one case, in one period of time, a juvenile would come in as a defendant, and then 6 months later, because they did not receive the treatment or address the trauma that may have even triggered whatever the altercation or incident was that led to them to be charged at juvenile court, they're, either back, for another case, or they're on the other side with me as a victim. And so that led me to really take a deeper look at what is happening within our system in addressing the trauma that our young people experience, both as a victim as well as somebody that may have been a perpetrator. And at the core of everything that, the work that I do in trying to advocate for all of our young people is really the focus on prevention. If a lot of our efforts that went into, and funding, to be, very specific, that goes into the incarceration. If even just half of that money goes into the prevention and really providing quality services and quality supports, not only to the child, but to the family, because oftentimes we don't look at the environment, we don't change the environment, we don't provide the supports in the family and environment that these children are coming from. And oftentimes when they're removed or, ordered to participate in a particular program or whatever, it just focuses on that child and not the holistic approach of addressing what the issue is. And so that is why I'm passionate about having a better understanding of what is leading our kids into the system, that oftentimes people think that it is going to help them or fix them or address their issues. And oftentimes it causes a lot more harm, or it's just not built to have that therapeutic support. So how do we develop a system that not only provides the intervention, but then the prevention services, so that we can, come to a point where our young people are not engaging in activity that either has them victimized, or that they are victimized, or that they're, offending someone else.
Thank you.
I think for me, one of the things I've always talked about as being a driver for my work with young people is my own experiences in this city as a young person growing up on the East End, and just seeing far too many people who I cared about, friends and family members, be arrested and prosecuted in systems that were not helping them, that were not providing meaningful treatment, that were not providing meaningful services, and really sort of wanting to change that trajectory for so many kids. That's what got me into the work. But once I actually became a public defender, I spent the first entire half of my career working almost exclusively with adults. And so many of my clients could point back to childhood, to dropping out of school, to being kicked out of school, to something that happened, traumatic incidents from childhood or in their education, as a direct driver into the system. First, many times into juvenile justice, and then into adult criminal legal systems. And so when I ultimately decided to settle and spend most of my time working with young people, I think really it was about wanting to get into that trajectory as early as possible and interrupt it. I think the driving force on a day-to-day basis is really the immoral way that we treat children in these systems, whether they are kids who are in the juvenile court system, or whether they it's the barbaric practice of charging children as adults. These are not, that's not a data-driven approach. That's an approach that makes people feel like they're doing something that they're not really doing. I think a lot of what Dr. Elliott talked about in terms of people, drivers, schools, and other community members thinking that putting kids into the system is getting them services that they need as a solution to what they may be seeing in the community. Sometimes people are well-intentioned, but I think that there's lots of reasons to believe that these services aren't helping, including the outcomes that we see in juvenile court and the things that children are routinely prosecuted for that are normative adolescent behaviors. And so some of what motivates me as a practitioner is sort of the day in and day out, what can we do in this particular case? But a lot of what motivates me is sort of overarching policies, and how can we make systemic reforms that will be permanent and lasting? How can we create a system that truly can help those who need help, and that pushes out kids, way too many kids who are caught up in the juvenile court system who don't need to be there, whether that be downtown, whether that be at the magistrate, etc. So those are the things that sort of are first and foremost in my mind on a daily basis.
That's great. Very good, Mick. You're up, Nick. Yeah.
Thank you. I 100% agree with Tiffany. The number one motivator for me has been my personal experience. I grew up in East Liberty during the 80s and 90s, during the arms race of the war on drugs era. I grew up in a household with an incarcerated parent, so I was an at-risk child. And a lot of the at-risk children around me are not with us today. They succumbed to either the criminal system or the streets. And, my question in my mind is, well, how can I convert the privilege and the opportunities that allowed me to still be here into a better way for others? And I think one of the best ways to do that is to reach children at the very early stages of a process where they may become court involved, and offer those opportunities for diversion that so many have not had and have ended up, reaching some kind of early demise or worse.
That's great. Thank you. So you all had different ways of explaining in different language that you were using to a certain extent, and yet all kind of share this passion for this work. And I'm just curious, we heard from someone who was incarcerated as a juvenile and now serving a life sentence, that my using of the term incarcerated as a juvenile is even a dehumanizing of them. And that really what I should say there is someone who was incarcerated as a child and now is serving a life sentence. And I'm just curious, in your work, how important is language in your framing issues? What are your thoughts about this issue of juvenile versus child? And is there other language that you use as a weapon for justice in your work?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot actually that goes on around language in courts, both in juvenile court and in adult court. Absolutely, language is stigmatizing. I think one of the things that I always talk about is that in juvenile court we use other words for parts of the process that are the adult equivalent. So we use disposition instead of sentencing. We use admission instead of guilty plea. Frequently, probation officers and prosecutors use juvenile as opposed to child or young person. And that is all very intentional. I think sometimes we try to use euphemisms, right, for things that are happening that is simply very straightforward, a prosecution of a child. And we try to use other words to make us feel better. And I understand, especially in Pennsylvania, although this varies by state, the purpose of the system is rehabilitation. But what we're really doing is criminalizing children from the youngest ages in Pennsylvania. That's the age of 10. And we are essentially preparing them in so many ways to be prosecuted as adults. And when I'm having private conversations with my clients, I don't, water down this language. They need to have some understanding of the intentionality of what's happening to them. And so sometimes I think we try to use language to make ourselves, we, the society, feel better. But absolutely, what we're doing is prosecuting children. What we're doing is arresting children. I have, in my practice, had children as young as 5 and 6 years old be placed in handcuffs in Pittsburgh public schools, even though they're too young to prosecute, right, and put into police cars. And so that is what we are doing. And so we have to face that reality, because that's the first most important step is to name it, right, and to say what we're doing, and then we can start to have maybe an honest conversation from that point.
That's great. Thank you. Any others of you who have a passion for language and use certain language changes in your work?
May I say something about that? I absolutely think that language is extremely important. And by using the word juvenile rather than child, we're othering the children who are being accused of things. And whether expressed or not, that is a clear outcome. It's funny to me, though, also the kind of systemic bias in the language that we use with respect to children who are in the court system. For example, here in Allegheny County, in Pittsburgh Municipal Court, we have what we call child's court. And that is a court where children are most often the alleged victims of the crimes. Yet whenever they go into a setting where they're accused, they become juveniles. And so there is this othering that occurs through language, and I think that it's extremely important to be mindful of language. Some folks, like the linguist John McWhorter, has made comments recently about how we're over-relying on criticism of language, and it's getting to a point where we're policing language too much. But I think that we can't police it enough, especially in the context of the criminal legal system and the system that prosecutes children.
And who was that, Mick, you said?
Linguist John McWhorter. He's a really well-known linguist. Was recently on NPR actually this week, talking about these more recent trends. He's always kind of been critical of certain approaches to language, but he's got a new book out that he was on NPR about this week, talking about kind of woke language and criticizing it, so to speak.
Yeah, the irony of the term policing language, I think. Well, the next question really is around even the specifics of this process, and what leads to children being arrested. What kinds of violations are those the top ones that children are arrested for?
So I'll take this question. So for us, we within the Black Girls Equity Alliance, we spent some time asking ourselves that question. We wanted to know when we talk about, again, language, and people talk about the school to prison pipeline, and sometimes it gets under my skin because it's just like it's this thing, but it's really people's lives, these young people's lives that are actually being impacted. But that's what we wanted to know. What are the charges? Why are they, being referred to juvenile court? And in 2019, we found that 55% of the cases involving Black girls were for disorderly conduct. And so we know that especially in an adult criminal justice system, that is a catch-all type of category. And so when you ask yourself, so what did the child do? It could be anywhere from disrespectfully talking to the teacher, didn't put their cell phone away, several, different things that we're like, well, how does that end up being a referral to juvenile court or to the magistrate or to the criminal justice system? And so that is, has been our focus in addressing, because there is really no evidence or no need for those cases to end up in juvenile court. And so it goes back to what we're talking about around prevention and intervention, that there are alternative strategies. The first response shouldn't be, let's call the police, for a teacher to say, let's call the school police to address this issue of a child not sitting in their chair. It's what are the other supports that are in the building that can actually really assess why isn't that child sitting in that chair? What is the issue? And that's what we don't often do, is take the time to understand what is the reason or the underlying factor of that behavior that's being exhibited. And if we do, when we have taken the time to look at that, even within our own program. So in Gwen's Girls, these are the same kids that go to the same schools. Our initial thought isn't, when they, don't follow the directions of what the staff want them to do, to call the police, right? It is to assess what's going on and to have a greater understanding. And oftentimes there's some issue, some trauma, some issue that has happened that's unresolved, that if you mitigate that, then all the other behaviors will tend to not be exhibited, especially over time. So, it is very important for us to continue to look at what are the charges and the reasons why our young people are ending up in front of a judge. It's just, we just did a preliminary scan of what happened last year, and we would think that because of COVID, the kids not being in school, and not as much in the community, that the numbers have gone down. Well, in some communities, they've either stayed the same or they've gone up. So now we're doing another deeper dive to look at, what's happening here? Where did these referrals come from, and why? Like, what are they? Right. So it's important for us to really do a diligent, our job to really look at the reasons why our young people are being referred to the system.
And I'll add on to that everything Dr. Elliott said, especially when we're talking about school, right? The criminal legal system treats truancy as a criminal offense, right? So there was a really eye-opening article in Public Source a week or so ago by Tylisa Johnson. And it said that in 2020 and the first half of 2021, there were more than 4,400 truancy cases filed in Allegheny County courts. 4,400. And as you were mentioning, with COVID, a lot of kids weren't even in school, and there's still 4,400 truancy charges in Allegheny County alone. So now a truancy charge doesn't just come with a court visit, right? There's notices, there's home visits, there's phone calls, multiple court dates, and then even fines that come along with that too. So all of these things that, again, are starting in the classroom often, what's supposed to be a learning environment for kids, ends up being somewhere that they're scared to go. Somewhere they're scared to go because of the reason Dr. Elliott mentioned. And they're scared of if they don't go, what happens? Are they going to face punishment at home because their parents are the ones that are going to be responsible for paying these fines? Are these fines and other sort of trauma that they're incurring going to follow them into adulthood and how they end up in the adult criminal legal system as well? So, every study shows that it's predominantly Black and brown students who are significantly more likely to be deemed truant than their white peers. And so, anyone that's listening right now, I really do encourage you to check out that article, Public Source, Tylisa Johnson. It was eye-opening to me, even as someone who thought I had a pretty good grasp of that problem here in our region. Definitely check it out, because again, on top of everything that Dr. Elliott mentioned about disorderly conduct, truancy is something that should never, ever see a courtroom, should not be handled by the authorities and by the criminal legal system.
What's so interesting is that following up on those truancy numbers from last year, as an the education side of our practice, we were, really, our kids were drowning last school year, educationally. I know Gwen's girls had a tutoring program. We had a tutoring program. There were so many local community centers that were trying to just keep our kids' head above water last school year. And, so much of what we were met with from schools was just a ask for some grace and some empathy, given that everyone was in the learning curve of how to teach remotely, how to administer remotely, and how to keep kids learning remotely. But at the same time, you're sending kids to court for truancy, right? And we know that in the majority of these school districts, especially PPS and others that were essentially all virtual for all of last year, they're sending kids to truancy court for not logging on from home, right? I personally went and stood in a line for a client with a, mom had surgery on her foot, couldn't stand in line waiting for a district issued laptop, and couldn't get a laptop, right, for a client. My clinic was in the position of having to just start buying laptops for our clients because schools were playing runaround and couldn't get computers and this and that. But somehow we have found the time to file 4,000 truancy cases that don't even go downtown. They go to magistrates, or if they do go downtown, if they're really egregious, they might go to dependency court. So these are not kids who are, this is fines. This is money. This is, as Bethany said, hauling people into court during a pandemic to lecture them about why they're not logging on for remote school when schools don't even have the resources that they need to teach the kids, right? And we're not even going to go down the road about our kids with disabilities, right? And the issues that they had with logging on. And so I find that to just be such an emblematic example of where our priorities are, right? Instead of thinking about how can we get every kid engaged? How can we ensure that every family is getting as much learning as we can possibly give in this really less than ideal environment? We're focused on 4,000 truancy citations. I mean, that is just That's really, again, it's a morally bankrupt position to be in for school districts. And it's really, people should just be ashamed of themselves for doing that.
That's,
And to add to
serious
that,
number.
let me just say this too, that the most frustrating thing is that while this was going on, organizations and me specifically was asking, like, making sure, I know that you all aren't filing truancy on the kids. Like, where are they? Do you need help? We will go door to door. We'll help you like figure out what's happening with these families. And it was like, no, it's fine. We're not filing truancy. We're not filing any. And then here we see who do the right to know and get the information. So it's just an ongoing missed opportunity. You know, the school system can't work without the community members. And we can't be as effective as we can in helping these kids and these families without being a part of what's happening in the school. Don't tell us after the fact. Like, again, prevention, let us be a part of figuring out how do we address the issue before it snowballs to you feeling like you have to file these petitions for, you know, all of these different truancy charges. It's ridiculous. We're in the community. These are our families.
Yeah, and just staying with this whole space of education, thing has just come in from the chat is, what kind of policies can school districts implement to avoid these kinds of issues being handled this way? Are there other school districts in other regions doing the work to combat this effectively? So anyone who wants to share something, weigh in there.
You know, I think that there are policies that are already on the books that people just don't follow. You know, throughout this whole process, I wanted to know, like, where's the state? Where's this Department of Education? And, you know, when it comes to accountability of what needs to be happening in these districts, there are things that are supposed to be happening, including around parent engagement and everything else that just the districts just don't do. Where's the accountability?
Yeah, appreciate
that.
that.
A lot of reframing. Oh. Sorry
about you got it, man. Go ahead.
I just meant to jump in. I think that a lot of reframing is in order on this truancy issue, and part of it is reframing with respect to what we expect to happen when a person comes to court. I think that the traditional frame is that what's to be expected is some kind of retributive justice, but in our court, what we emphasize is a more restorative approach. And so when truancy cases do come into our court, and we did have a fairly significant uptick in truancy cases that were filed in our court last year, the goal is to first examine what might be the cause, because I strongly believe that may be happening within the house with the child or with the school. I think that an equitable distribution, so in terms of framing, I should say, I think that a lot of the outcry around this recent article, which was very well researched and excellent to rely upon, comes from a place of, we expect someone who is referred to court or accused of something to be subject to some sort of form of retributive justice. Oftentimes, a court can be a place for a person to be heard who hadn't had a chance to be heard previously, and it can be a place for problems that had not previously found a resolution to be resolved. And that's what we try to emphasize in our court. I have found that an equitable distribution of resources, not just an equal distribution of resources, but an equitable distribution of education resources, can make a profound impact in terms of the number of truancy cases that are filed. Under the amended truancy law, truancy filings have gone down a great deal because it's now within the discretion of the school whether or not to file. They can rely on other approaches to coming up with a student attendance improvement plan before coming to court. Previously, if there were a certain number of absences, the school had to file with the magistrate. Now this is not the case. The school still has the discretion. Some schools file more than others, which the public source article showed. But what I've found is that schools that have a lot of in-school community-based resources, or schools that have a lot of access to out-of-school community-based resources, tend to file less. And I think this just comes back to, once again, equitable distribution of resources. At the same time, if a matter does need to come to court, because there is a possibility that it may need to be referred to a dependency court, and it's coming to court rather than being child-lined or rather than having CYF be called first, I think that those resources also have to be right there in the courtroom. And here in Allegheny County, we do have Department of Human Services present at every single truancy hearing. Unfortunately, once again, with last year's pandemic, what happened was there was a total deterioration of the social safety net. And so services that traditionally would be available in a school wouldn't go into the household to be available there. And even the programs that the Department of Human Services would refer families to really were overwhelmed or not able to function the way they normally would. So there was a lot kind of going on, but at the end of the day, I do think it comes down to, one, equitable distribution of education resources, and two, kind of making sure that we're taking a restorative rather than a retributive approach when matters do end up in court.
And remember, just to add on to that, like when we're talking about resources that are needed, housing instability is one of the primary contributing factors to why children are struggling in school, right? Like, how hard it is. We've all been kids. We've all been in school. How hard it is just to get through school when nothing is going on outside of school, right? So when, pre-COVID, whenever, I know the eviction moratorium and everything has luckily slowed down some evictions, but nearly 15,000 evictions were filed every single year in Allegheny County. And do you know who was the single demographic that was most affected by those evictions? It was single mothers with children, and disproportionately Black single mothers with children. So, often when we talk about like what's going on in school, whether it's disorderly conduct, whether it's kids missing school, is that they're being displaced from their homes and then being expected to show up and go to school and act like everything's fine. Act like homework is their number one priority. Act like their spelling test next week is really what they're thinking about, when really they're worried about, where am I going to sleep tonight? Where am I going to get my next meal from? And so when we have all that instability outside of the classroom, it's no wonder that inside of the classroom, kids are struggling, right? And they need the resources just like their families need the resources. We need to remember that they're human beings and that they're going through a lot of the same emotions that we're going through as adults. So when they're getting evicted from their homes and their lives are completely disrupted, the path that they were on is completely derailed, the schooling kind of takes a back burner, making sure I show up for school, making sure I'm not losing my temper and getting in an argument with another kid. Like, that's on the back burner when it comes to like survival mode. And there are kids who are every day experiencing homelessness just within Pittsburgh public schools. I know that I read an article somewhere, I'm sorry, I don't remember who this one was, but that there were 955 students experiencing homelessness this spring. And that's just in the Pittsburgh public school. That's not in the 42 other school districts that we have within Allegheny County. And so that's, just something that we need to think about when we're talking about resources that are needed and what's going on, why are kids ending up in the courtroom, but also, what is going on outside of the classroom, outside of the courtroom that's a contributing factor, and how can we support them as community, as has been mentioned so many times? How can we support these kids and their families so that they can focus on what's really important, like not have to worry about adult issues, but just be kids and get to enjoy being kids without having to worry about such complex issues and being displaced.
Yeah. And we know, the overall quote unquote justice system has this huge aspect of racialization, right? That's a part of it. And you just mentioned Bethany, who's most disproportionately impacted. And a question from the audience is around just even the role of POC or Black teachers in the issue then of truancy or disaffection from school generally. Are there other things that you see as like secondary factors in your work where you feel like, okay, this is how the racialization of children is showing up? And are there any things that you all do to try to disrupt that?
I think the data, suggests that obviously similar to the adult legal system, that there's disparities at every decision point in the juvenile legal system. I think, what is most important to me is that we have children who, have educators and grownups in all of the stakeholder roles who has a diversity of life experiences, right? And who can relate to these kids and some of the things that they've experienced. I think that that's critical, because when you have people who are sitting there literally thinking, I can't relate, right? I don't understand what it's like to be hungry, to have experienced a day of homelessness, to have, I think I was just talking to somebody earlier about trials that cases that I've tried where there is, we know that sometimes when there is frequently when there's a police brutality aspect to a case, who the person who is the subject of that brutality ends up getting charged with the crime, right? And that is not different for children than adults in many situations, right? But if you don't have a fact finder who or a stakeholder who's making decisions around these cases who can understand that experience, then I think that we are, these systems will continue to be failures for the communities that they serve. So when I think about who we need at the table, we need people who come from the same community, who've lived the same or similar lives as these young people. And, Bethany was talking about sort of, we expect children are going through the same things that we're going through as adults, but we expect them to have an adult reaction, even though we know that they're children, right? So as grownups, we may be able to say, well, it's rough at home, but I have to suck it up. I got to go to work today because I got to get this paycheck. So I just got to deal with it, push it down. Kids don't have those coping skills. We know that, right? And these are scientific facts. And it's so frustrating that people want to pretend like this isn't the case, that when children do things that mimic adult behavior or that adults are frustrated with or feel like they don't want to deal with, then all of a sudden we just give up and say, well, they should know better. And the fact of the matter is they don't know better. Their brains are still developing. They're still learning coping skills. And the people who are there that are supposed to help them cope are failing them. And so I just feel, like it's really about the representation, the lived experiences of the adults who have to work with these kids. That's really critical.
Yeah, I agree. And that is something that we have tried to, and that we do embody at Gwen's Girls, in hiring people who have that lived experience. It is important to have people who have that book knowledge and clinical knowledge, but there's really nothing like that true lived experience, because that what that young person is particularly going through. And then on this, I agree with you 100%, Tiffany, around how we attribute sometimes the adult decision making that our young people should have when they are children. And so that is something that we have been exploring extensively in teaching our young people about adultification. One of our partners, Dr. Jamelia Blake, has been, very instrumental in highlighting that oftentimes systems and adults in schools attribute behavior of young people that that they should have, what you said, Tiffany, the capacity to make a decision as an adult, and they are only 12, they're only 14, and they're not able to really think long term of the consequences and all those different things. But even more significantly, that the study that she had done also, proved that sometimes the bias that exists, that our young people don't need the love and the support and the nurturing that their white counterparts get at the same age. And so that to me is the most troubling, because our young people need to feel it's that love, it's that support, it's that, someone telling them you can be whatever you want to be and not somebody speaking down to them. That really is going to be the change in some of the what's happening in our schools, that it only takes one person to really believe in you to know that, yes, I can do it, I can make it. And those are the type of people that we need in our schools, that we need our young people to be able to have as mentors and to be in our lives, because there's all these negative things that are already existing in our communities that kind of impact them in a negative way. It needs to be counterbalanced with the love and support. And so until we get to that space and get people that look like them and have that same experience and understanding of what they're going through, we won't see the change that could happen for our young people on a greater level.
And sometimes it's not always necessarily a teacher. One of the things that I learned in terms of causes of truancy, like Bethany was talking about, is that I think it came out of Pitt, a study a few years ago showing that housing instability was the number one cause, or not number one cause, but most often the key factor in the household of a child who was deemed truant. But in terms of prevention, I believe it was the United Way that came up with a program years ago. This was a data-driven program where they were putting mentors in schools and partnering those mentors with young people who were at risk of being truant, and it had a dramatic impact on student attendance. A young person has something to look forward to when going to school, somebody they can relate to and can be friends with outside of the immediate peer circles.
So yeah, we identified that disorderly conduct and truancy. Mick, I'm wondering if there's any other things that come through your court, that any other things that you would say are what children are arrested for?
Yeah, arrested versus charged. I would defer to Tiffany's expertise on juvenile court and arrests and let her talk a little bit about some of the differences there. But in district courts and magisterial district courts, children are charged oftentimes with summary offenses, disorderly conduct, underage drinking, harassment. These are all under the Crimes Code, Title 18. They can be penalized with a $300 fine or up to 90 days in jail. And truancy is also a summary offense that children 15 years or older can be charged with. Children can be charged with motor vehicle code violations. Children who drive can be charged with summary offenses. These are all things that can land a child in court. And that is really just an entry point. When we talk about youth incarceration, that is your first interaction with the system. If a young person is fined as a result of a summary offense, a fine is no frivolous penalty, especially for a young person who presumably doesn't have the means to pay a fine. If a young person or anybody else doesn't pay a fine, oftentimes a bench warrant is issued. If a young person who's charged in the Crimes Code with disorderly conduct doesn't pay their fine, then the matter must be resolved referred to juvenile court. There's no discretion in the magistrate there. If they don't pay the fine, the case has to be referred to juvenile court. So all of these are kind of entry points that then further escalate and escalate and escalate, and can result in a young person being incarcerated. And once a young person is incarcerated, once a child is incarcerated, we're oftentimes causing more harm and more trauma than the young person came to court for or had at their initial appearance or entry into the court system. It has a terrible spiraling effect, and sometimes it starts with the issuance of a traffic ticket or a truancy citation or something that the affiant or whoever is issuing it may just see as a citation, but it could be something much more significant for that young person. So the approach that I've tried to take as a magistrate is really build up community-based resources for alternatives. Sometimes, and I mentioned earlier, those community-based resources are right there in the school. Sometimes the school is connected to them, but they're in the community. And sometimes there's resources out there that aren't connected to the school, but that they can be connected to a court if the judge is so inclined. And I've made a point to try to connect as many of these resources that I know of to our court. For example, at the end of the school year last year, there were some high school age students who were accused in truancy cases. And rather than decide their cases, I referred their cases to an alternative adjudication program where if they completed the program, their case would be dismissed. And that program was One Hood, which isn't necessarily connected to a lot of schools, but it's right there in the community. We have a strong relationship with One Hood in our court, and they completed their programs with flying colors and their cases were dismissed. And now we're at a new school year where they're not having to deal with, remote learning and things like that. And so I think the question is, how can we create these alternative systems that are effective? How can we create an abundance of them in the community so that we don't have to rely as much as we do on punitive measures and things like that?
That's great. I said arrested and you kind of clarified versus being charged. And I wonder if one of you might actually speak to the specifics of this process. What are the steps that will have a child end up being incarcerated? If one of you might just kind of just outline what's happening there.
Sure. Well, when a kid is arrested, if they're arrested and they're being charged with an offense that, so if it's something that's going to go to the magistrate, that's going to usually just be a summary citation. So they will get paper and then they will have a court date sent to them in the mail. So they usually won't be arrested in the sense of, handcuffed and taken anywhere. If it's something that an offense that would go to juvenile court, a police officer cannot just admit a child into juvenile detention. They can arrest a child and then they have to go through juvenile probation, there's always a juvenile probation officer on call 24/7, 365 to assess whether that child is appropriate according to juvenile probation to be admitted into juvenile detention. And so if they say no, probation says no, then that child will be released to the parents. And again, a court date or a letter from probation will come later in the mail with further instructions. If the probation says yes, then the child would be admitted into detention at that point with a detention hearing in front of a hearing officer, one of our local hearing officers, a couple days later. If a child is arrested on the street and charged with an offense that is excluded from the Juvenile Act because they are being charged as an adult, meaning there are certain crimes in Pennsylvania that if you are arrested and charged on the street for those crimes, you are not eligible to go to juvenile court. So, which does not mean that you're not eligible to go to juvenile detention. That's another story. That's a choice that we make to send kids to the jail. But if you are currently in Allegheny County, if you're arrested and charged with a crime as an adult, then you would go to the jail. And then the normal adult legal processes would take place. And later on down the road, in a few months, you have the opportunity to ask to go to have your case treated back in juvenile court.
Okay.
Generally speaking, what the police on the street or the school police or whoever, generally speaking, whatever they list as the charges on the police report end up being sort of at least in this county, end up being the charges that make it to the actual charging document. And then if something is going to get changed or amended or thrown out, that usually happens much later in the process.
Right. And I'll just, add on to that about like the kids who are held in the jail, right? There are, as of today, there's 32 children that are in the Allegheny County Jail. So when people hear about the jail and, how the death rate at the ACJ is higher than the infamous Rikers, and you hear about that the entire jail has been on solitary confinement, 23-1 lockdown since March of 2020, people often forget that there are babies that are held in there right now. It is my opinion that no child for any reason should ever be held in the Allegheny County Jail. I appreciate Tiffany kind of explaining how kids do end up there, but it shouldn't be that way, right? And we need to implore our elected leaders, our legislators at all levels of government, especially at the state and federal level, to make policy decisions and policy changes to prevent children from being housed in that jail. 90% of the children in the Allegheny County Jail are Black children. All but one of those 32 children are boys. And so when we look at, the demographics of Allegheny County, and then we look at the demographics of our Allegheny County jail, specifically the children that are housed in there, it's so disproportionate. And that's when we need to dig into, like we're doing today, why is that happening? It's not because these children are, doing more wrongs than their white peers, but it's because of over-policed communities, under-resourced communities, and all of these factors that we've been talking about today, like resources. How much money? It costs $100 per person per day to hold them in the Allegheny County Jail. Imagine if we invested even a fraction of that into the communities that these children are being pulled from, into the neighborhoods where kids are being over-policed, where they're being over-arrested, where they're being sentenced to often life as a child. And so, especially during COVID, when we're looking nationally at conditions in jails, remember that every single article you read about the jail, there are babies in there who are being subjected to these same conditions as the adults.
And I just want to follow up again. I did allude to it, but it's a choice for us to hold children who are charged as adults in the jail. The law as it stands right now does not require that. It may require them to be charged as adults as the law stands right now. Hopefully that will be changed, but it does not require them to actually be held at the jail. That is a decision that judges, that magistrates and that others are making, right? That is not a requirement by law. Those children can be held in juvenile detention facilities. I know the Schumann is closed now. That's a whole other story, but they can be held in juvenile detention facilities. There is no requirement that they be held at the jail pre-trial until these, issues about whether they're going to remain in adult court or go to juvenile court are resolved. And the other thing I would say about the which is frequent, if there is a girl charged as an adult at the jail, there's usually only one, right? And by federal law, that child has to be sight and sound separated from adults. So what does that mean? I mean, we can think through the answer. That means fundamentally that child is in solitary because she can't be with the boys and she can't be with adults, right? So that child is by herself. And it's frequent that if there is a girl there, it isn't that frequent, but when there is a girl there, it's usually only one. And we know all of the body of literature around how harmful solitary confinement is, even in very, very small doses. And then you put that on top of a developing brain. And so that is extremely, extremely problematic.
Yeah, and remember that number, that 32 number, that is up 146% from the number of children that were incarcerated 1 year ago. 146% increase in these babies being locked up in cages in the jail. So,
and there was a recent study by a scholar named Megan Stevenson who studies pretrial detention a lot, and she asked the question: when you do the balancing test and you're determining the level of risk that a person presents pre-trial, and whether or not that level of risk justifies their pretrial detention, she concluded that, and this is a February 2021 very, very new study, that almost nobody is that much of a risk that they should be incarcerated pretrial because of the level of harm that it can potentially cause that person. Now, imagine that in the context of a child. And like Tiffany just pointed out, very succinctly, the level of harm that a normal person would be subjected to, the level of trauma and mental health outcomes that could result from a person being left in solitary confinement, and then magnify that on a developing mind in a child, there's almost no justification. And so one thing that I came across recently in Pittsburgh Municipal Court was a 16-year-old who was being held in the Allegheny County Jail, charged as an adult for a serious allegation. And there was a request to continue the case to a new date, to continue the hearing to a new date, because the child was being held in quarantine. in the Allegheny County Jail. So that raised in my mind the sight and sound separation issue that was just brought up. And I wonder to what extent children are being separated sight and sound, whether or not that is still something that the jail is complying with during the pandemic, and if so, by what means? Is it this 23-hour lockdown the children are having as well? Are they being kept on the same pods but just kept in their cells the entire time? But in close proximity to adults otherwise? I really wonder, because so much has kind of just disintegrated in terms of normal procedures and expectations in the jail and otherwise during the pandemic. And I wonder what effect that has had on these most vulnerable children who are incarcerated here in our county.
Yeah. Can you all talk about, we've seen now that Schumann is closed for its own violations, and what are going to be the implications of that in terms of this issue? Or are you already seeing consequences of that regarding what happens to children who are arrested now who would have gone to Schumann? Is that going to increase the numbers going to the jail? If you could just talk about what you think that means and any suggestions that you have about that.
So kids are not, kids who would otherwise go to Schumann are not going to the jail. They're going to out-of-county detention centers. They're going to Latrobe and other places depending on bed space and availability, right? And that's a big problem because these kids aren't, again, these are pre-trial for the most part. Before Schumann's closure, the vast majority of kids there were pre-trial, and that's what Schumann really functions as. It's the child equivalent of the ACJ. Most of these kids are pre-trial awaiting outcomes of their cases, and so Schumann, for all of its whatever cons, negatives, was in the community. There was a bus stop at Schumann. And if a parents frequently before COVID attended those detention hearings in person, right? They're in a hearing room with their kid, with the hearing officer, etc. And even if we could raise the curtain and COVID would disappear tomorrow, that can't happen anymore. You don't have that opportunity. Lawyers were there with their client right there next to them. You wouldn't have that opportunity to have these people in a room and able to sort of figure out whether there's a way to release this child immediately to the community. And so, I have always been in support of finding a way to not detain children pre-trial, because even juvenile detention is harmful to children. But it is extremely problematic. I will always maintain the way that Schumann closed, because there was not an agreement that we were going to stop detaining children pre-trial. And all of a sudden, kids just started getting put in other places, in other counties, and there wasn't much, and still to this day, isn't much consistency about where they can go, right? On the other hand, we now have a closed Schumann, and we can work towards that ultimate goal of zero pretrial detention or whatever we need to do. But right now, kids are being detained in other counties, and that's a problem. That's a problem. It's people, there was an immediate pushback that we're not going to stop detaining kids because Schumann closed. And so here we are, still detaining kids, just detaining them further away from home.
Can you all speak maybe even to the specifics of, like, in Allegheny County or in Western Pennsylvania, that's how that data is recorded? I guess I imagine it's probably recorded by city and county. How long are children incarcerated? What is the steps that kind of, you've gone over the steps, but how long are they incarcerated, and what is the specifics of ways that they must be treated, but how is that actually happening? If you can just kind of peel back the layer on what exactly is happening, that'd be great.
So average detention for pretrial detention is pretty low in Allegheny County, and it hasn't gone up for juvenile. These are kids held in juvenile detention, not kids held at the jail. That's a different number. But kids who are held in juvenile detention pre-trial is pretty low, under 10 days on average. But that's 10 days away from school. And that's 10 days away from family. And so I'm not aware of data at this point that it's gone up dramatically since the closure of Schumann. But again, you think about the fact that these children are being transported to and from secure facilities in shackles, in long van rides when they're coming to and from Allegheny County. Department of Human Services has statewide regulations that govern kids in juvenile detention, all juvenile detention facilities, and that is one of the things that led to the closing of Schumann, was failure to comply with those statewide regulations. And that is a lot. I mean, I know some of the HR regs, but I don't know them off by heart. Bethany may know more, but there are statewide regulations that govern how children will be treated and et cetera in juvenile detention facilities, both pretrial and long-term, like post-disposition facilities.
But when you talk about the children that are in the Allegheny County Jail, these are children who are charged as adults. And so they're not held to the same strict standards that, Tiffany just mentioned are taking place at the juvenile detention facilities. So I know one of the kids that I talked to at the ACJ had been there for 14 months. Again, awaiting trial. No conviction, awaiting trial, 14 months. And so they're not only missing 10 days of school, they're missing entire school years. They literally, the jail contracts with the Allegheny Intermediate Unit to come into the jail and actually conduct schooling in there, because that's where their school is now. They've been there for so long that that's where their school is. And again, these are people who are unconvicted, awaiting trial, are separated not only from their schools, but their families, their friends, their communities, all the resources that could be there to help with the rehabilitation process. Instead, they're being locked in a cell without any of that. And so again, we get into how the cycle continues, how it extends from their youth all the way through adulthood, because it's almost as if they're being indoctrinated at the jail, and they're saying that this is, the system is telling them this is okay for children who have not yet even been convicted of a crime, under the presumption of innocence, being held in a cage at a jail. And yes, they are on a different pod than the rest of the pods at the jail where the adults are housed, but especially during COVID, they're on a different pod in solitary confinement, 23-1 lockdown every single day since March of 2020. We're over a year and a half now dealing with that. We know how mental health, how solitary confinement is impacting mental health in adults being held in solitary confinement. Imagine children whose brains aren't yet developed, haven't reached that age of their brains being developed yet. And again, and I cannot stress this enough, who have not yet been convicted of a crime.
I was going to say, following up to what Mick said and Bethany just said, so ACJ does have a school, and my understanding is that pre-COVID, that was a school where, the kids really could get a respite and have some learning, but it's been closed. And so the learning is now all not closed, but the learning is all taking place on pod. And the kids weren't for a long time mixed, sight and sound separated. There were some threats a few years ago to sue the jail. So they did get their own pod, but they've been on 23-1 because of COVID, right? So they don't even sort of get that school experience in the same way that they used to get it. And so it's just really, it's sickening, right? It's disgusting to think about a 14 or a 15-year-old child being on 23-1. It's sickening to think about an adult, but it's just, again, morally bankrupt to think about doing that to a child. And that is what we are doing. We are doing that. Every day that we as a community allow this to go on and participate in that process, we are implicated in that. And what if this kid, right, takes a plea and gets out, gets a time served plea? Who are we releasing back to the community? Somebody that's been 14, 15, 16 months, 18 months on 23-1, and we're saying, good luck, don't come back, have fun on probation or whatever, or parole. I mean, it's just completely. I don't know what people expect. I'm not, and I'm being honest. Like, I'm not sure what people expect. Do people expect that kid to come out and be like, "Man, that was a rough 18 months anyway. What's been going on in chemistry class?" Like, I just don't. We're doing things that don't make a bit of sense, and expecting to have these results, expecting these children to be changed, expecting these children to live up to an expectation that we ourselves as adults could never meet. And we're expecting them to do it with no help, no treatment, no decompression, no anything.
Well, three questions have come in, so I want to put them all out, and then maybe you all might pick which one you want to go to, and we'll go through those. So one is just where someone's written and said, "Can someone please touch on the cash for kids aspect of this? Because at the end of the day, children who are low income get treated differently than a child who has means." And I'm speaking on, this is the person talking about the children who the court systems call wards of the state. So that's question one. The second one is there an oversight board for juveniles or children the way there is for the ACJ? And third one, if we can hold all of this at one time, which is when people are being, when children are being moved to other counties, whose taxes are paying for that? So if you all might just pick where you want to jump in on any one of those three.
I'll answer those last two because they're actually, unfortunately, pretty simple answers. We're paying for it. You're paying for it. Everyone on this panel is paying for it. It's our tax dollars, right? So when there is an extra cost for transport, because inevitably there are, because they're not all being shipped to somewhere that's local. Schumann was right down the street in these, as Tiffany mentioned, some of the places that they're being shipped to. That's us. We're all paying for it. The oversight board question. So there is the Allegheny County Jail Oversight Board. So we also have oversight over the juvenile pod in the Allegheny County Jail. There was a Schumann Center Advisory Board that was its own. It wasn't called an oversight board, the advisory board, same thing. But again, they weren't as public or transparent as the jail oversight board, I would say, is starting to be. But now that Schumann Center ceases to exist, we don't have an oversight board with representation in the other juvenile detention facilities because they're not our juvenile detention facilities. So currently, in the current situation, the only oversight that we have, as far as like governmental protections, public oversight, is the jail oversight board. And that's only the children who are housed in the Allegheny County Jail, which again, 1 is too many, 32 is way too many, but there are plenty of other children who are in facilities now all over the region, the tri-state area, because of the closing of Schumann. And we, as taxpayers, as community members, don't have to fight over those.
Can you say, Bethany, is it actually the same structural relationship between an advisory board and an oversight board? Do they each have the same amount of authority and power?
Ish. So the Jail Oversight Board has a actual Pennsylvania statute that empowers us to protect the health and welfare of every single person in the jail. So we are statutorily mandated to provide the oversight. We are, statutorily required to do unannounced inspections, public reports about those unannounced inspections, to have a meeting once a month, and for that to be a public meeting that follows the Sunshine Act, accepts public comments. We are statutorily mandated to do that as a jail oversight board. The Schumann Center Advisory Board was a county. It's not a state statute that it's governed under. It's actually written into the county charter, along with the dozens, if not hundreds, of boards and advisories throughout the county for a bunch of different issues. Whenever the conversations were coming up about, the repeated violations at Schumann Center, did my own research just trying to look into what is the Schumann Center Advisory Board and what do they do. And man, I thought county council was not transparent, but trying to look into that information about the Schumann Advisory Board was even worse. I could find out who was on it, and that was about all I could find out. No regular meetings, no public minutes posted, very little transparency or accessibility for anyone who was looking into it. And I know what to look for, and I still had trouble finding any of that information. But the Jail Oversight Board is the one that actually is statutorily mandated to conduct oversight. And that's kind of what I've been pushing for on the board the past going on 2 years now that I've been there is, We have to do this. We have to provide oversight. We have to protect the health and well-being of the people in that jail. This isn't optional. This isn't something that the county decided when they were writing the charter, 20 some years ago, that, hey, I think this is a good idea. This is something that the state actually mandates us to do. And so anything falling short of that is a violation of the statute and a dereliction of our duties.
So I think one thing on the other question, which was the, do children that are low income get treated differently than children who have means?
Specifically, the wards of the state, I think they're asking as well.
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure if they're talking about kids in dependency or kids in delinquency, but just to talk about sort of some of the money flow. So most of our kids in Allegheny County go to private placements if they're placed out of home. And that's actually true on both sides, dependency and delinquency. And like Bethany said, we pay those facilities hundreds of dollars a day for those kids to be in those facilities. And again, the Juvenile Justice Task Force website is still up and running, and you can go there and look at the data around this. But we pay lots and lots of money for those kids to be in those beds every single day. And we do have some state-run facilities, but how I think that plays out frequently in a bad way in court is that a lot of these private placements have an incentive to say that kids have not completed the program, that they need to stay for longer, that they need to do one more thing, that they need to finish one more module, right? And when we have stakeholders who don't push back, probation or prosecutors or judges who don't say, listen, this kid has been there for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, however long, right? And we just say, okay, placement said you're not finished yet. You just keep staying there. You just keep staying there. You just keep staying there. There's sort of this perverse financial incentive for these private placements to say, we need more time with this kid. And so that's okay. They have their financial incentive. But what the stakeholders need to do, judges and probation officers, is say, no, that's it. We're done, right? When we've met the goals of disposition, or when we think that any benefit that this child could receive from this placement is exhausted, rather than sort of be a rubber stamp, we need to take a critical look and say, does this young person, because out of home placement harms kids, and the Pathways to Desistance study, which is one of the best national studies that's been done about it, out of Pitt, that looked at 3 cohorts of kids, including a Pennsylvania cohort, ultimately concluded that out-of-home placement for delinquency offenses is at best neutral and frequently harmful. And so what we actually need are people who are willing to say enough is enough. And that is really where I see sort of that financial incentive come in a really bad way, is people rubber stamping what the placement says instead of taking their own critical look. I saw in the chat, so dependency is the child welfare system. So that's CIF and the county agency, et cetera, et cetera. That is the dependency system. So if a child is alleged to have been abused or neglected, if a child is alleged to be a runaway, to be, in some cases, chronically truant, out of control, at home, quote unquote, ungovernable, that's all sort of falls under the dependency or child welfare statute. And then delinquency is what we've really been talking about a lot, which is kids who are charged in juvenile court with crimes. But for the sake of out-of-home placement, Allegheny County uses many of the same placements, and many of these placements have both dependency and delinquency sides. So if a child is solely dependent, meaning they're not involved in delinquency at all, they cannot be held in any secure facility. But if a child is delinquent, then there's a possibility that they can be held in a secure out-of-home placement. But many of these private entities have a non-secure side and a secure side. So they're just like, we'll take all your kids, right? If it's a group home because it's a dependency only, or if you need a kid who needs to have a kid that needs secure placement, we'll take either one, or some kids are in both systems.
So we've been talking a lot, as though, this system is just something that we expect. It exists and we expect it, but everything has an origin. And I'm just wondering if you all can talk about what is the underlying reason, and maybe even the history of this idea of juvenile incarceration. Does it have where does it come from, and what is the reason that it even emerged, this idea that children should be incarcerated as a way of dealing with the choices that they make?
I mean, I don't know what the right answer is, but I will tell you from my perspective and, from what I've experienced and what I've seen, what I think it is. I mean, I think it's in line with our entire criminal legal system, is that, I have to catch myself sometimes, and I have to remind people that the system is not broken. It was very much designed this way. So whenever people say the system is broken, what they really should be saying is that the underlying inherent values upon the foundation upon which this system was built is inherently flawed. It is built on, over policing, militarizing of policing, and in racism, systemic racism. And we see that in so many different aspects of our society, but especially in our criminal legal system, and especially when it comes to incarceration. And I'm sorry, Dr. Elliott, but the school to prison pipeline, and, all of these things that we see and that we've been talking about today, it was designed this way to start certain children from certain neighborhoods of certain races and certain socioeconomic statuses in the hole, and have them have to fight so much harder to get up out of that hole than someone else, maybe from a wealthier suburb, a white child who doesn't start in that hole, and they can fight the same amount. And that white child with the means to do so will be able to flourish more easily than that child who from the start, was in that hole and trying to dig themselves up out of it. The system was designed to be that way. And until we change the system, we can have all the conversations that we want. Until we have the right people as judges, as magistrates, as policymakers, as legislators, this is the system that we live in. And we can do all we can to try to, conduct mutual aid and resources for these folks, but it's the system that needs to change, because it's not broken. It's working for a hell of a lot of people who are very happy that the system is set up the way that it's set up. We need to change the whole system. And a great way to do it is from within, to do what so many of us on this panel here have been doing, and that's get in it and change it. I say fix it, but change it.
Exactly. That's, one of the things that we've been focusing on within the Black Girls Equity Alliance. And what I alluded to earlier is that oftentimes we have programs that are geared towards, focusing on the girl and the issue that happen, or, the behavior that they're exhibiting, but we don't take the time to look at the system itself. And as you talked about, Bethany, how it's designed. Our education system is designed not to educate and provide quality education to our Black and brown children. I mean, it's been years. We've been fighting the same fight. And until we decide that we have to do it ourselves, we're going to still be, kind of having the same argument, right? It's time that, organizations like APA and Gwen's Girls and One Hood was brought up. There's a lot of grassroots organizations that are in these schools and in these communities and fighting for the change that is necessary. Because again, a lot of people want to focus on how do we hold the children accountable? How do we hold the adults accountable that are supposed to be providing the supports and the safety and educating and uplifting our young people? It has to be done at the same time. And we got to practice what we preach. You can't tell a kid what they should be doing, but then at the same time, you are not holding up your end of what your job and your responsibility is.
Well, earlier, and I'm sorry for that thing on the specific history piece. In just preparing for this, I happened to read something around like Puritan laws, and they were incarcerating English children. I think that just fell into my question, but I appreciate your larger comment, Bethany, about this larger systemic racism process, and that's how it fits in. And at the very beginning, I'm not sure which one of you spoke to the adult. I forget the word you used, but it was like adultizing. Thank you, adultification. Thank you, Dr. Elliott. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you can, maybe if someone could speak to this whole question around when can a child be charged as an adult, right? What are the specifics of that? How young is too young? Should that whole idea of a child being charged as an adult, should that be modified? Should it even be able to exist? Can you all talk about this idea? I know you're a child and I charge you as an adult. And that all that you can say about that.
Can I maybe just tie in real quick the history question to this one? There was a movement in early 20th century in the United States to completely separate the criminal legal system from the legal system that would prosecute children who were accused of violating the law. But that eroded around the same time as the war on drugs, the post-civil rights era occurred. So as you see this huge ballooning of the prison population in the United States, late 70s, early 80s, and so on, is around the same time you see laws around charging children as adults and reducing the ages at which children can be held delinquent, so on and so forth, emerging. So it was kind of this drumbeat to rely on criminal processes and incarceration to solve social problems that led to the erosion of that movement from the early 20th century and to about mid-century. And so now we have, I'm sure, laws that Tiffany can speak to very knowledgeably that allow us to prosecute children as though they were adults, even though they're obviously not. One thing I would speak to, though, very briefly, there was some reference made to kids for cash. And that phrase comes from somewhere. That phrase comes from what was called in parts of the world one of the worst youth human rights atrocities in modern history. And that happened right here in Pennsylvania in Luzerne County, where 2 juvenile court judges were found to be taking kickbacks from a private juvenile detention facility. So they were trading kids for cash. They were sentencing children, detaining them, sending them to this specific facility, and receiving private income from the owners of the facility, allegedly. These judges were ultimately, of course, removed from the bench and convicted of tax evasion. But this happened right here in Pennsylvania. It's really something that we all should continue to remember and continue to be ashamed of here in Pennsylvania as we come up with alternative systems for treating young people who have engaged in problematic behavior potentially.
Yeah, I didn't know if that's exactly what the the questioner was asking about, but for sure that was, and there's a great documentary about that that's widely available called Kids for Cash, and I encourage people to watch it because as a professor I have my students watch it every year because it is critical that we not repeat that. And after Kids for Cash, after the Luzerne County scandal, there was a commission and there were some reforms made to help try to prevent that from ever happening again. Among the many reforms that came out of that was that there's only now a very limited number of circumstances where a child can waive their right to a lawyer in juvenile court, because that's one of the ways that it was happening there frequently, was that kids were being advised to waive their right to a lawyer. And so they were going in front of judges, those judges and other judges unrepresented. And so there was, they were just being told it'll be okay, just go in front of the judge, and then being sent to placements for extreme periods of time. One of the kids that they highlight in the Kids for Cash documentary literally had made up drawing of their principal as a pig or something and put it on Facebook and was charged with a crime for that and ended up in a locked detention facility, right? Again, normative adolescent behavior, things that kids do, and ended up in a locked detention facility. So that is really, and both of those judges remain in prison. But so kids charged as adults. So there's a list of crimes in Pennsylvania right now. They're sort of the ones that people think of. The most obvious one is murder, and then armed robbery, armed rape, armed carjacking. And when I say armed, it doesn't necessarily have to be with a gun. It can be knife, it could be bat, it could be rope, right? It could be other things. I'm thinking of cases that I've specifically had when I sort of name these things. That if you are 14 or older and you're charged with these offenses, you're excluded from the Juvenile Act by law, meaning at that moment, if you're arrested and charged with that, you are automatically charged as an adult. It's called direct file. And you can, like I said earlier, fight down the road in what's called a decertification hearing to try to get back to juvenile court. But there's no discretion there, even for a prosecutor to say, we will not charge this child as an adult right at this moment. I've talked a lot publicly about the work of the Juvenile Justice Task Force, which is ongoing. We're now in the phase where we're trying to get legislation passed to take up the recommendations. And one of the recommendations, I didn't think it went far enough. I'm not speaking out of school. All the task force meetings were public, but is to really greatly reduce the number of offenses for which direct file exists. I think the compromise that was made was murder would continue to be a direct file as well as, I think, armed rape. But everything else would start in juvenile court. And if the prosecutor wanted to attempt to transfer that child to adult court, that's a hearing that would take place in juvenile court. Currently, for the offenses that kids are excluded and must be charged as an adult, the hearings to send them back to juvenile court take place in adult. So the argument is that those hearings should take place in juvenile court with juvenile court judges who are very aware of kids, who work with kids every day, who understand the unique adolescent development goals that apply to children. And so as a member of the task force, we want our recommendations to be adopted by the legislature. I encourage people to call their state senator and their state rep and ask them to vote in favor of this legislation when it comes in front of them, because that's a legislative fix. That's not something that a prosecutor right now has the discretion to say, oh, this 15-year-old is charged with murder, but I think it's something that should stay in juvenile court. That's not an option. And so we need those changes to take place.
Do you all think that there's any reason why a child should be charged as an adult?
I mean, I've said publicly, my position hasn't changed. In my 17-year career, I have not met a child who I don't know if there's a child out there. I haven't met that child, but in the cases that I've seen, the kids that I've worked with and that I've, seen my colleagues work with, I have not seen that child yet.
Yeah. There's a comment from the audience which says there's judges who've been in juvenile court for 20 plus years, working from 9 to 5 with the same PD and the 88 same public defender, and I imagine that's assistant district attorney. There has to be a better way, because Monday, Wednesday, Friday they hear delinquent cases, and then Tuesday is CFY, Thursday is, and she says this has been going on for 20 years. Can you all dig into that? What that person has said? I'm not sure I totally know all what's happening, but they clearly have direct experience.
So I think what they're referencing is the fact that, generally speaking, both the DA's office and the PD's office assign a regular attorney to a courtroom, right? So Judge Smith, I don't know if there's Judge Smith. If there is, I'm not talking about Judge Smith. But Judge Smith, right, has, John from the DA's office and Jane from the PD's office, and those are their lawyers, and they're in their courtroom every day. There's different attorneys for delinquency and dependency, but essentially the judge has the same team on dependency days and on delinquency days all the time. And that sometimes does last for many, many, many years. And so what is the inherent, what are the issues with that? And I got to say, this is something that was unique to me when I started practicing in Allegheny County. It's not this way everywhere. And in some counties, it's even worse, because in some counties, there's one judge counties, right? And so it's the same judge who hears every kind of case in that county, right? And so things that when I train defenders from around the state that I hear is, I don't want to piss off this judge. I have to be with this judge 3 days a week. Or this is the only judge in my county, and I'm a general practitioner. And if I piss him or her off, I'm never going to get court appointments. I'm never going to, win a case. And I think it's a deep, I agree. It's a really bad systemic problem, because I think it makes advocates on both sides rethink their zealousness at times, because you got to come back and you got to be with this person all the time, right? Even something as simple as, think about if you're a lawyer and you want to go on vacation and the judge doesn't like you, so they decide, well, you better find somebody to cover the cases on those days, because my vacation is in June and your vacation is in July. But if the judge likes you, maybe they'll say, try to work with you, right? Let's try to be on vacation at the same time, so we can, the whole courtroom can be down. Things like that people don't think about, but that can definitely affect advocacy, again, on both sides of the table. I mean, it's a system problem. It's a system problem for sure.
Well, what do you all think about alternatives? And I guess maybe I'll just come to you, Mick, is around or Judge Pappas, the question around it. You can hear, like, I guess, a carceral logic underneath, a punishment logic, that the way to solve problems is to punish people. And I think in the very beginning, Dr. Elliott mentioned that the victim and the perpetrator can switch places, and this idea of, like, that people are often themselves hurt in all of this, right? And you've mentioned other kinds of processes in your courtroom that you try to bring up. So what do you think are alternatives that you practice, that you see other judges practicing, that you think should be more widespread around alternatives to this of punishing?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty basic, and everybody, I think, who's here listening or part of this conversation knows this. We as a country over-rely on arrest and incarceration to solve social problems. And so we have this default frame of mind of, and somebody brought this up earlier, I think it was Tiffany, when we do release a child from a period of imprisonment or detention, what is our expectation in terms of what happens next with that young person, knowing how challenging it can be for an adult to emerge from that type of condition? What are we expecting to occur when a child is released from those types of circumstances? How long will it take that child to heal? And have we done justice in this situation? Will that child ever heal? How long will it be until the traumas that they've now experienced or dealt with while detained come out through some other type of behavior that was perhaps more problematic than whatever it may have been in the first place? I mean, what is our expectation here? What is the logic, as you said, Justin? I mean, and so when we talk about alternatives, we talk about reframing our thinking around common sense. Thinking to the end goal. What do we want? What does justice look like based on what's alleged here and what the facts met out? And what do we want the outcome to be? And that's what I would call taking a more restorative approach, not necessarily saying that we believe that incarceration will solve whatever problem has occurred here. Because most of the time, and we know this as a fact, it will not. It's only going to cause that problem to recur and actually amplify throughout the community. So we have to deal, I think, honestly with facts, and we have to push back as hard as we can against those who would attempt to keep our framing in this old state of mind, who would attempt to blame individuals for social problems, and who would attempt to show us or try to convince us or persuade us that Willie Horton politics still has a place in modern discourse in terms of the criminal legal system or the legal system that's relied upon to prosecute children.
Willie Horton being... Oh, please go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if I can add on to that, like I have said, since I was released from incarceration, I often say in my recovery that I am in recovery despite my incarceration, not because of my incarceration. And I feel like that applies to children as well, is that children who are successful after being released from incarceration, it's not because of what happened while they were incarcerated. It's because they had a support system. They had the resources. They had the education, housing, stability that is needed to rehabilitate. Those things are not happening within any detention center walls, whether it's a juvenile detention center or the Allegheny County Jail. If they need treatment, get them treatment. If it's housing that their family's struggling with, help them with housing. If it's education, find them an educational setting that works for them. Support the children, support the parents, support the families, support the communities. Like, this isn't any radical idea. It's what works. It's what we've seen work over and over in places that it's been tried. That is what helps people, especially children. They need that support, the stability, education, in some cases, job training, even if it's like help like get their hair done, like get clothes that they're comfortable in to go out and then go to school in every day, like whatever it is that it takes to support them. That's what we do. Those are our alternatives to incarceration, because oftentimes we have children who are in the system for so long that sometimes it feels like, oh, well, what are we going to try now? How about the one thing you didn't try? Don't lock them up. Provide them with support and resources, and let's see what happens, because everywhere they try it, it works.
And let me just add on one quick thing. When I say push back hard, and I think this is very germane to this discussion and what I think we're all trying to accomplish, I don't mean to suggest that we argue with fools, that we try to convince folks who can't be persuaded or get caught up in arguments that are not worth our time or energy. What I'm suggesting is that we push back by creating these alternative systems right here in the community that can be relied upon by fair-minded stakeholders.
Yeah, let me add to that an initiative that we've been working on with the Black Girls Equity Alliance in partnership with Judge Clark, of exploring what does an alternative, and I'm going to say alternative to diversion and alternative to detention or diversion, but it's even before the need for detention, we should be providing those support. So having a process where families, so for us, Gwen's Girls, we get a lot of calls for parent-child conflict. And a lot of times, parents don't know what to do, so they'll call the police. And so what happens is the police will show up. Sometimes they will remove the kid and, it ends up in juvenile court. But the majority of the time, it's a citation. It's a process that they're not getting what they think that they're calling to get. And they don't get the support that they need early on. So then one issue leads to another issue, leads to another issue. And so there's a lot of great work going on in the city of Pittsburgh and throughout Allegheny County in the communities. How do we work together? Everything is so siloed. How can we create a process that if there is an issue in the school, in the home, in the community, that there is a process that somebody could call other than law enforcement? Because as just Pappas said, like, we are so, indoctrinated in using law enforcement and using the criminal justice system to address issues that are really in the need of social support. How do we get that to people? And that is the process that we've been diligently working with DHS and juvenile probation and a lot of other partners to just actually try to implement, because that is going to be the key. We have the answers. There's a lot of great programs happening in the community, but the access to them and the communication to getting people to utilize them, it's not there. And oftentimes it ends up, they may end up in a good courtroom or in front of a good magistrate that will refer them to and have knowledge of these community-based organizations, and a process that at the end their child won't have some type of criminal record. But 9 times out of 10 for Black and brown youth, that's not the case. And so we need to fight so that is the case, that there's this process that and then at the same time, changing that mindset that if something happens, and hear my language, I'm saying something happens. I'm not saying a crime was committed, because a lot of times these something that happens are issues that really aren't criminal acts. Right. But because people don't know what to do, they'll call the police. and it becomes a criminal act. And so how do we get out of that mindset of utilizing law enforcement to actually address the issues that need to be handled from a social support perspective?
And
I
can you
think
speak
one
to
thing
that?
I see a lack of is, and this could, again, as Dr. Elliott was just discussing, this could be my lack of knowledge, but I feel like the thing that I'm frequently missing is sort of that crisis piece in between when they're in crisis and when they can actually get engaged with services, right? And so, like, a lot of times in the moment, the family's in crisis, and I think, well, I know about this program, but like, you got to call on Friday morning to do intake. But like right now, and I know that on Friday the program will take them, but what are we going to do to get from right now, right, Wednesday at 5:45 to Friday morning, right? What are we going to do to keep my kid from running away again? What are we going to do to keep my kid from, whatever the situation may be? And as Dr. Elliott said, so much of it is not crime, right? It's conflict. It's family conflict. It's coping. It's trauma, reactions to things. And so I feel like it's those little crisis pieces. And if we could have more of those that are not systemically based. I mean, I really think so many of the solutions are about having programs that don't require you to go through the system to get access, right? Because parents call the police because they think that there's going to be services on the other side, not because they want to see their kid in jail or they want to see their kid at Schumann or, whatever, or because they want to see their kid in a locked facility at Western Psych. They call because they don't know where else they can go, and they think that this is going to start a process. And the problem frequently actually is that they don't get what they're looking for. And then they just get caught up in a system and a problem that's bigger. Again, I think Kathi said earlier, that's bigger than what got them involved in the first place, right? And so, I just think that it's that little, if we can get people from the crisis moment to the engagement moment, then I think the service engagement moment, then I think we can help more people. And not to go all the way back to Kids for Cash, but another one of the kids in that story was just that, a kid whose parent was frustrated. I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, she literally put marijuana in his truck and called the police because she wanted to get help for her kid, right? And that kid ended up in a locked facility, right? She had the best intentions, but it's just, we have to be able to provide people with resources outside the system if we want to have less people in these systems.
Yeah.
Let me just make a quick comment too, Tiffany, that it is important that the 24-hour access, because it's not something that that ends at 5 o'clock, right? And so that there's that support, and even over the weekend, because that's when things happen, and so people need to know where they can call to get the support outside of having to call the police.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that Tiffany raises, though, because it causes us to really be thoughtful about our approach. Because in one way, we're saying, how can we make sure that courts and even law enforcement or detention facilities have connections to the community? But at the same time, we have to ensure that community resources are independent of those institutions. I think that a good example in a different context, and Tiffany's exactly right, that a lot of these services, access to them depends on court involvement. Another good example is in the domestic violence context, where so many supports are tied to a law enforcement approach to responding to alleged incidents of domestic violence. The Violence Against Women Act was a watershed moment for our whole country. For the first time, we adopted a national policy on domestic violence. It's an incredible achievement. But at the same time, a lot of the resources provided for under the Act are specifically tied to court involvement in law enforcement. And so it's really hard to come across some of those resources in other ways. And someone who might seek support outside of the court system might actually be questioned in terms of legitimacy of their claims because they didn't file a claim, they didn't file a PFA, they didn't call the police. So is there really a problem? Well, yeah, but I'm trying to seek solutions outside of those approaches. And, it gets met with skepticism, unfortunately. But this is a way that a lot of people want to approach these things.
And that's the point I was trying to make around it, that this process, not be diversion from the course. Like, it is truly community supports. I understand that I have an issue and this is where I can go to get some support. And that there had that, and that, a lot of people within our meetings, that was something that was a resounding, viewpoint, that it should not require somebody to have to be involved in a system to access these services.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the big national grants, right, and national government grants, I think specifically here in Pittsburgh, I don't know about everywhere, but here in Pittsburgh, I think a lot of our local foundations do a good job of funding these programs. But they are local foundations and their resources are not as great as like government and federal and state level grants. A lot of them, only because this is something I do in the clinic a lot, is look at these grants, require that you either work with a government entity, work with a court entity, or work with a law enforcement entity as a partner in order to have access to, or to even be eligible to apply for that grant. And that mindset has to change. We have to put faith in our community organizations that they can do the work without having to funnel it through a court system, a government system, or a police system. And that they can do that work directly for the communities that they serve without having that hook that then causes, people. I was talking to a woman a couple weeks ago who has a CYF case, and she was also, apart from her CYF case, in a domestic violence situation, and she was afraid to report the domestic violence to the police because she thought it would negatively impact her CYF case, right? And so, like, this is somebody who is terrified of the system, right? Terrified that her kids would be taken away from her or kept away from her for longer if she reported that she was a victim of domestic violence. Like, that's a problem, right? That's a system failure that somebody believes that that's even possible, that if they report being a victim, that it will affect their ability to keep their kids or to get their kids back.
Well, and maybe, Bethany, I know you might have to hop off a little early, but I had one question that might relate to your work, which is, APA and One Hood did work earlier this year, looking at the ways in which the amount of money that's spent in policing and the need to rethink community safety generally. And just what you were raising there, Tiffany, is the how to pay for all of this, right? Which I think, no pun intended, the $1 million question. So we know that we've got good programs and alternatives, but the issue is how to pay for it. And I'm just wondering if you all have any kind of big policy ideas about, like, and when you're, Bethany, doing your work at county council and this comes up in budget, how do you think about it, and what the rest of you think about this issue of how this gets paid for?
I will answer that first because I think it's a very easy question that gets overly complicated all the time. The money is there. A budget is your list of priorities. Whatever your governmental entity assigns as its highest priority, that's what it gives the most money to. Whatever it assigns as something that they do not think is important, they do not think needs the time and dedication, that's what they assign the lowest amount of money to the budget, or no money at all. You want to know what the highest spending category, like single highest budget item in the county is right now? We have a $2 billion budget. It's the Allegheny County Jail, $100 million a year on a jail, right? So when we talk about it, why don't we take those resources out of that jail, right? Take that money that's being spent in that jail and put it into the communities. When we talk about the police officers, I know I grew up in Ross Township. They have a tank. They have a tank, a suburban police force with a tank, right? So when we talk about how do we fund it, All the money is there. You just need people who are willing to have the political willpower and the courage and the, you know, the priority to give the money where it's needed, right? On top of all that, we have between 50 and 70 million dollars in a rainy day fund in the county budget. And that's just the county. You know, we have 130 separate municipalities who are struggling to survive on their own, right? We have 43 school districts, some of them that are going under, some of them that are flourishing. We have all these inequities across, and that's just in Allegheny County. If we're going to go, you know, throughout the entire Commonwealth, if we're going to go out throughout the country, there's, you know, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars that we have already. So all it takes is people to say, you know what, this is what we're going to prioritize. This is what we think that our tax dollars should pay for. You know, people say all the time, no taxation without representation, right? How are you being represented when your community members are being thrown away in the jail, right? 96% of the people in the Allegheny County Jail have not been convicted of a crime. So you're paying for your community members to be locked in cages and treated worse than you would treat your animals. And you're telling me that we don't have money to invest in our communities, to invest in equal funding, equitable funding of education in schools, to make sure that kids have a safe place to go when they get out of school every day, to make sure that they don't have to worry about missing school, being charged with truancy or disorderly conduct because they know that they have a stable home to come home to. They know that their parents are going to be able to put food on the table. Like, that's what we need to prioritize. It's services, it's resources. The money is always there. It's just about who is going to have the courage to say, we're giving money to these things because they improve our society, and we are not giving money to these things that are a severe detriment to our society and to our community members.
Yeah.
I did not know that Ross Township has a tank.
Boom, I'm going to class.
Thanks so much, Bethany.
Did not know they had a tank.
Dr. Elliott.
You feel more safe because I doubt anybody knows how to drive it. But
I don't. I mean, how do I follow that? That's clear.
I thought you were saying you wanted to.
No, I was saying mic drop for her.
Mic drop. You were just saying. Yeah, I see you. You were saying, go ahead. I got that. Okay. Was anyone else going to comment on that? I have one little more a little more of a smaller technical question, but someone might be wondering, which is a question around what happens to your record if you are convicted. I'm not sure I'm using the right language about children. Is it children are also convicted the same way adults are convicted? But if you are, does that get expunged when you get to be 18? Does it follow you forever?
So for magistrate, for summary offenses, at the magistrate, 18th birthday plus 6 months and clean and no further issues, and you will be eligible. This is like the 30-second answer. For juvenile court, it is if it's diverted, or if you if it's a diversion, 6 months after case closure, with no further issues. If you're actually adjudicated delinquent, which is the nice euphemism for conviction in juvenile court, it's 5 years after case closure with no incidents. And so you can stay in juvenile court till you're 21. So that could be as late as 26 before you're eligible. And the first degree felony sex offenses, so rape, aggravated indecent assault, and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, are not eligible for expungement in juvenile court at any time right now by law. It's not discretion. No one can override that. If you have some intervening issue with the law during those waiting periods, then you would have to get the DA's consent to an expungement. So nothing's automatic
for those things,
or
eventually.
Yeah, or a part of the time. So that's the long and the short of it, is nothing is automatic. Definitely in juvenile court, there's nothing about turning 18 that's like magic. And right now, in Allegheny County, there's no fees for filing a juvenile expungement. And that's not everywhere in the state, but that's in Allegheny County. And as of right now, it's something that you have to actually do. Juvenile probation does some of them. They're getting better about doing more of them. But if they haven't done yours and you want to get it done, you literally have to do it. The public defender now does it for their own clients. The youth advocacy clinic at Duquesne does it for anyone. who needs it, adult or child. So that's like the basic overview on that.
And you were saying something, Judge Pappas. I'm not quite sure everyone
Oh,
could
I'm
hear.
sorry. I kind of jumped in a little bit, but I know it can be weird on remote. I was just saying that if there is one of those offenses out there that can't be expunged, the only way to suppress it from public view or to make it go away would be through a pardon from the governor.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're really at time. If you all have anything you'd like to kind of share in closing, please do.
I just really enjoy being part of the discussion. I want to thank APA and everybody here for always being great colleagues and advocates in the community. And I think that people oftentimes come to this question, and we as a generation must also confront this question, which is, how do we want to be remembered? And I don't believe that history will look kindly upon a generation that incarcerated young people, put children in cages so that we could feel more safe from our own children. It's a terrible paradigm to be working with, and we as a generation, I believe, have been called upon as this kind of post-mass incarceration era. I don't want to refer to it in the past, but we're aware of it in a broader sense. I think we've been called upon to end it once and for all, and that should be our mission.
I would echo everything Judge Pappas just said, every single word of it. And I would just add that I think that we are at a very synergistic moment in the city and in the county. And we have probably some of the best energy and leadership to get this right now. And I think that we should take 100% advantage of that, because the movement for mass incarceration, and that included our children, took every single advantage of every single moment they had. And so I think we have to meet that with an equal force, or a greater force, to stop the very morally bankrupt practice of putting children in cages. And I also strongly encourage people to get involved with contacting their state reps and state senators about supporting the Juvenile Justice Task Force legislation that's going to be coming forward in this session.
And ditto to all of that. And thank you for having me. And I'm happy to be here. And as Tiffany said, those that are listening, get involved. We need you. Our community needs to show up in force and to be a part of the process, and not just stand by and watch things happening in our community and to our kids.
I think we're going to have a slide of how to get in contact with people to get involved. Hope I'm not saying that in error. And I just want to thank you all. It's been great to learn from you and your work, and also echo thanks to APA for convening us. And good night.
Peace.